They say, the old canard is that genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. Well, my mother brought to the equation a highly loaded genetic gun, as we'll see. And my father, with his sort of shenanigans, I think, put it on a hair trigger. So it was that combination that I think gave schizophrenia a downstream effect in our family. It pushed it into the next generation. My mother was hesitant to have children because when she was a young girl, her mother had schizophrenia, her brother had schizophrenia, and it all went back to her grandmother's great-grandmother in Ireland, in County Roscommon, Ireland, who came over in the Great Irish Famine. And there were lots of others too, but it wasn't talked about. You know how it is. It's just somebody shadowy in the family background. But she knew what was happening and told my father, well, when he asked for a hand in marriage, yeah, well, great, but I don't want to have any children. So he said, well, let's go talk to a medical doctor. And they talked to one medical doctor, and he said, this illness runs in families, and someday science will prove it. Not taking no for an answer. My father went they went off to New York to see another medical doctor. And I think my father might have greased his palm or something, but he said, go ahead. He said, as long as they're raised in a nice, stable, loving environment, the underlying predisposition will not express itself. So my parents took that advice, and I think my father kind of ignored it. He didn't know, he didn't understand it the way my mother understood it, and she did understand it. And when 20 years later it began pooling in my immediate family, taking 2 of my 4 sisters, it was devastating to my mother. You know, I know there's 3 million people roughly suffering from schizophrenia in America, 1 in 100 worldwide, all countries, all cultures. We know that now. The same with bipolar, you know. So that's a lot of, you know, we're talking about, you know, 6 million people right there just for those 2 mental illnesses alone. And we really are a silent majority. And sometimes I think that they're just a number, you know. So I want to pass around just a little photograph I have from the USA Today. There's stuff here written. You don't need to read it. Just glance at the photo and pass it on to your neighbor, because I want you to understand who these 2 girls were who suffer from schizophrenia, my sisters, and who they are. This photo was taken by Polaroid. When the very first Polaroid Instamatic camera came out in the mid-60s, it was really the iPod of its day. I mean, in a way, it was bigger than the iPod. If you remember it, it developed instantly. And with that camera came a set of instructions, and with that set of instructions was a photo on the cover. And it was the photo of Austin and Michelle, we call her Shell. These 2 sisters who were the ones who would be stricken by this biological disease of the brain that strikes from out of nowhere mysteriously at the cusp of adulthood. They were so lovely that, in every sense of the word, inner and outer beauty, that Polaroid, and that inner beauty shines through, that Polaroid wanted you to believe that if you bought their camera and used it, your kids could be as beautiful as these 2 as well. So I just passed this around. Now, I'm just going to read from my book. This was the book I was never going to write. I never intended to write this book, even though I was in journalism. I'd written a couple of books on other subjects. This topic was a no-go zone for me. I felt that I couldn't approach it in a non-exploitive way. I felt that I'd be throwing my sisters under the bus for the sake of an art project if I wrote a book about it. And that was one of the mental demons that I struggled with. It's turned out to be anything but that. It's turned out to be a really good experience, a real healing experience for me and my 4 sisters and my nephew. We often all step out together, and talking to other families and having other families. The book is an invitation for you to tell us our stories. We tell you ours in this book, and you share back, and that's been very healing for us. I'm going to start out with the illness followed a maternal line in my family, going back to County Roscommon, Ireland. But the first one that we heard about was my grandmother, May Sweeney White, and I never met her because she had her rapid onset in the 1920s and was sent to live in Cranston, Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Mental Institution at the Howard campus for the last 30 years of her life. And she died right before I was born. But this particular scene is the hardest one in the book, so I just want to warn you about what I'm about to read to you. I'm going to read you 4 passages. And so you get a sense of our family. And it'll take me about 12 minutes, and you get a gist of the book. To my mind, May Sweeney's story was the scariest and therefore probably the most schizophrenic of all. Her incident, as my mother called it, happened on a crisp autumn day in 1924. There was already some doubt about May's rickety state of mind that morning, but by evening it was obvious that she was the latest victim. The 29-year-old mother of 6 must have thought it was a special day because she picked out her best outfit, a dark shawl thrown over a chiffon dress, a velvet cloche hat, and a pearl necklace. It was the 1920s. Slipping on a pair of white kid gloves and without leaving a note, the poised-looking beauty set off through the leafy streets of Providence, just an hour's drive down the old post road from Boston. No one saw her go out for the day, and by twilight her husband had grown worried. Jack White, my grandfather, waited at their modest Hannah Street bungalow in the heart of the Olneyville section of town, watching from the window in the gathering dusk. Normally, Big Jack was a sea of calm, but today he was concerned for a host of reasons. For one, May had not been eating properly. For another, it was past sunset and unsafe in the city at night, and it was not like a young woman to stay out so late, her whereabouts unknown. Out in the unlit parts of the neighborhood or in the hidden banks of the river, bad things were known to happen. Mostly, though, it was that May had not been herself. Once cheerful and lighthearted, she'd grown aloof and lifeless in the months since her 6th child was born. The melancholy, a listless sort of head fog that had come over her, now hung like a dark bank of clouds. They suspected postpartum depression, but that wasn't it. At last, Jack sees May's figure approaching in the darkness. In her white-gloved finery, she moves up the walkway, but something is amiss. She is clutching her shoes. Her hat is cocked, her makeup smudged. May stands in the middle of the road, her shoeless feet swollen and reddened, hard worn, it would seem, from hours of walking. She says nothing, but as Jack goes out the gate to meet her, her slow grin says it all. Every tooth has been wrenched from May's head. Her gums a swollen and bloody mess. Jack drops the teacup, shocked by the sight of her. Jesus Christ, he shouts, what has become of your goddamn teeth? May, it turns out, was nobody's victim. She had gladly paid for the dental surgery, she said, to stop the voices in her head. The voices had grown in power and strength until she could no longer bear them. The voices told her they would go happily if she would free them from her dental cavities. Whether extensions of her mind or enemies in her head, these strange voices lied though. They were still chattering, her empty gums still bleeding, as May collapsed into my grandfather's arms and was carried inside to an old Victorian fainting couch. We leave the station quickly, Shell skipping off to the senseless melody line of her newfound madness. As we drive back home to our house on the east side of Providence, I go with her out of this world and into another one altogether. In the passenger seat, she brings me up to date on her love life. She says she has just finished a fling with Warren Beatty, the film star and well-known womanizer, dumping him for Jesus of Nazareth, a true gentleman who she believes to be the Romanian star Ilie Nastase. Shell says all of this with a voice so full of "you gotta believe" that I strain to follow her logic. She says the whole world is getting ready for her marriage to Jesus. From what I can gather, the wedding is to coincide with the end of the world as we know it. The event should go off just swell, she says, if only Dad doesn't get drunk and spoil the day. I just had to end it with Warren, Shell explains breathlessly. And what can I say? Dumping Warren Beatty, dating Jesus Christ? These would be high-class problems for any young actress. It could be worse, I tell myself. Whatever's wrong will surely pass. I had a bad ear infection as a kid, and I was delirious for a week. I thought it was something like that. Because even though we have mad amounts in our family, in very severe cases, it still wasn't talked about. So great is the stigma that we can talk about later. Shell will be back to her old self in a few days, I tell myself. In the meantime, at least I've landed a sympathetic role in her romantic comedy. I'm the best man, apparently, because Shell says I'm John the Baptist. All right, then. So I'm there for a few hours, and Shell's bouncing off the walls. Eventually, she'd get a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar manic disorder.